The Night Stalker, Part 1, The Walk. He walked most nights. Not for exercise. The 5 o'clock training sessions covered that, and the afternoon classes covered it again, and by the time the last student had left the dojo in the evening, his body had been in sustained use for 12 to 14 hours and had no requirement for additional cardiovascular work. He walked for the same reason he had always needed specific blocks of time with only himself, because the kind of thinking that needed to happen in the intervals between the active hours required a particular quality of unstructured movement, the body in motion without purpose, the mind free to do what it did when nobody was asking it to do something specific. He walked the streets around the Torrance dojo after the evening classes, the residential blocks to the north, the commercial strips to the east, the industrial margin where the neighborhood transitioned into warehousing. It was familiar territory, which made it comfortable for unstructured thinking. The familiar doesn't make demands. This was 1974, which meant the streets had a quality particular to Southern California in the early 1970s, the specific atmosphere of a place that had not yet resolved what it was going to become. The suburb of the post-war boom, still new enough to have ambitions and old enough to have accumulated the texture of actual use. Hawthorne Boulevard at 10 o'clock at night was a different thing from Hawthorne Boulevard at noon. The businesses were closed, the commerce had retreated, and what remained was the infrastructure, the streetlights, the parked cars, the facades of buildings that were waiting for tomorrow. Chuck walked south along Hawthorne, hands in his jacket pockets, thinking about the federation proposal he had been developing, the draft governance document that he had been revising for 3 weeks and that he was beginning to understand needed a different approach to the committee structure. He was thinking about the specific language of the voting mechanisms when the situation changed. It happened in the space between 2 streetlights, the area of relative shadow, a section of parking lot belonging to a closed hardware store set back from the sidewalk where a car was parked that had not been there on his previous passes along this route. The car was a late-model domestic sedan, dark color, engine off. 2 men were leaning against it. A third was visible in the driver's seat. What changed the situation was not the men. Men standing by cars at night in parking lots was a condition of urban life. What changed it was the way they arranged themselves when they saw Chuck, a specific shift in posture and position that he recognized from the tournament circuit, from the years of studying opponents before matches, from the specific competence of someone who had spent 15 years reading physical signals. They were going to try to rob him. He had about 8 seconds, based on the distance and the speed at which the 2 men were moving, to intercept his path. He did not slow down. He did not speed up. He did not change direction. He walked straight toward them. He did not change direction. He walked straight toward them. Part 2. The conversation. The 2 men stopped when he moved toward them rather than away from them. This was not the expected response to their positioning. They had positioned themselves to intercept from the side, the standard approach for this kind of situation, which put the interceptors between the target and the continuation of their path. Chuck's decision to move toward rather than away from them created a situation their formation was not designed for. He stopped about 6 feet from the nearest one. The man was in his late 20s, broad-shouldered, with the specific quality of aggression that comes from a combination of practice and chemical assistance. His companion was younger, early 20s, thinner, with an expression that was performing certainty but was producing, around the edges, the slightly different quality of someone who was uncertain. "That's an interesting position you've taken," Chuck said. The broader man looked at him. Whatever he had been expecting, this was not it. "We've got a," he started. "Don't," Chuck said. It was said quietly, in the same conversational register he'd been using, not as a command, as advice. Don't say the thing you were going to say. It changes the situation in a way neither of us wants. The man stared at him. The younger companion stared. From the car came the sound of the third man, the driver, shifting his weight, which Chuck registered in his peripheral attention without looking at the car. "Who are you?" the broader man said. "Somebody who doesn't want to hurt you," Chuck said. "And who can?" The specific quality of stillness that settled over the three men in that moment, the moment of assessing whether what they were looking at was what it claimed to be, was something Chuck recognized from the seconds before a match began. The specific quality of calculation that happens when two people are trying to determine the cost of the available options. "You don't know what you're messing with," the broader man said. But the quality of it had shifted. The performative certainty was present, but underneath it something had changed. The way the weather changes when the pressure system has moved even before the visible signs arrive. "I know exactly what I'm in the middle of," Chuck said. "The question is whether this is worth it to you. Not whether it's worth it to me, whether it's worth it to you." He paused. "It's not. Nothing in my pockets is worth what comes next for you if you continue." The silence lasted several seconds. Chuck had no performance in his posture. He was standing in the same way he stood in the dojo, in the same way he stood everywhere, not at rest, in the martial sense, but present. The quality of readiness that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The broader man stepped back. The younger man looked at the broader man. From the car, without a word, came the sound of the engine starting. The broader man looked at Chuck for another moment. Then he walked back to the car. The younger one followed. The car drove away. Chuck stood in the parking lot for a while after they left. Bothamenton Obridia. Part 3. The walk home. He continued south on Hawthorne, then turned west, then north toward the residential streets that connected to the dojo neighborhood. He was thinking about what had happened, not with the quality of retrospective fear which he had learned to manage over years of competition and the specific training that competition requires, but with the quality of analytical attention he brought to anything he wanted to understand. He had known he could have hurt those men. This was not pride, it was a practical fact, as accurate as any other fact about the physical world. He was 34 years old and had been training specifically in the application of force for 15 years, and the three men in the parking lot, whatever their own capabilities, were not in the same category of physical preparation. He had also known that hurting them was not the available option he wanted to choose, not because he was afraid of the legal consequences, though the legal consequences would have been real and significant. Not because he was uncertain of the outcome of a physical confrontation, because he had spent 15 years building something, a practice, a philosophy, a way of understanding the relationship between capability and restraint, that the situation in the parking lot was an opportunity to apply, and applying it required doing what he had done, which was to talk rather than to fight. This was the thing that martial arts training had given him, that the outside view of martial arts training had never quite understood. The external view of what he did looked like preparation for violence. What it actually was, what he had been discovering in the 15 years of building the practice, and what Park Sung-jin had shown him in the first sessions in Korea, and what Bruce Lee had argued for with more philosophical precision than anyone else he had encountered, was preparation for the specific quality of confidence that makes violence unnecessary. The three men had left the parking lot not because they were afraid of what he could do to them. They had left because he had been more present in the situation than they were, more settled, more certain of what he intended and what he did not intend. The certainty itself, the specific physical and psychological quality of it, had changed the calculation they were doing. He thought about his students. He thought about the ones who came to the dojo and said, in various forms, that they wanted to be able to defend themselves. He thought about what he taught them, the techniques, the forms, the competition preparation, and about what he believed he was actually giving them, which was the thing that had just worked in a parking lot on Hawthorne Boulevard. Not the technique, the presence. The specific quality of being where you are without performance, without the gap between your internal state and your external presentation, without the management of perception that most people conduct as a continuous and unconscious operation. In competition, he was fully present because competition demanded it and the training had built it. Tonight, in the parking lot, he had been fully present because the training had built it. The technique was the form. The presence was the content. He had known this in various formulations for years. Tonight had made it concrete in a way that the knowing had not previously accomplished. Omasenafta Jusosh. Part 4. The class the following morning. He taught the 5 o'clock session and then the 8 o'clock, and at 10 o'clock, before the intermediate class began, he changed the session plan. He had been intending to work on the second sequence from the intermediate form, the sequence that required the most technical precision and that the intermediate students had been working on for 3 weeks, and that was beginning to arrive at the edge of genuine competence. Instead, he sat them down, 15 students, ages ranging from 19 to 46. Different circumstances, different reasons for being in the room, different histories with the practice, all of them looking at him with the specific quality of attention they brought to the beginning of sessions, present, expectant, the bodies already in the mode of readiness that the dojo environment produced. "I want to talk about something before we train," he said. He told them about the parking lot. Not the full version, not the complete account of what had happened and what he had thought on the walk home. The functional version, the version that contained the essential information. "3 men," he said, "tried to rob me last night, and I talked to them until they drove away." He watched the room process this. He could see several responses operating simultaneously. In some students, the response was skeptical, the implicit question being whether talking was really the primary mechanism, whether the physical capability hadn't done the real work of the deterrence. In others, the response was something more like recognition, the response of people who had been training long enough to have developed the internal experience of what the capability actually produced. "The technique is not the point," Chuck said. "The technique is how you develop the point, but it's not the point itself. The point is the quality of presence that the technique, when genuinely engaged with, eventually produces." He paused. "When I was standing in that parking lot, those 3 men were not afraid of what I could do. They were responding to what I was. There's a difference." A student in the second row, a 28-year-old named Michael Park, who had been training for a year and who had the quality of someone who received information differently from how most people received it, said, "What does that mean practically? What are you describing?" Chuck looked at him. "Have you ever been in a room with someone who was genuinely at ease with who they are? Not performing ease, genuinely in it?" "Yes," Michael Park said. "What does it feel like?" Michael Park thought. "Like there's less to navigate. Like the interaction is simpler than most interactions." He paused. "Less noise." "Right," Chuck said. "The presence is the condition where what you are and what you appear to be are the same thing. There's no gap. Most people manage a gap. They manage the distance between their internal state and their external presentation, continuously, without noticing they're doing it. The gap is the noise." He paused. "The training, when it's working, closes the gap. Not by changing what you are, by making what you are present in the interaction rather than managed." He looked at the room. "In the parking lot last night, I wasn't trying to be something. I was something. And the 3 men in that parking lot, whatever their intentions and their capabilities and their history with situations like that one, they could feel the difference between something and the performance of something." Part 5. What Ray Medina said. After the 10 o'clock class, Ray Medina sat across from Chuck's desk with the coffee that was always there in the mornings and which was usually consumed at a pace inversely related to the urgency of what Ray needed to say. "I heard about the parking lot," he said. "Word travels," Chuck said. "The class talked," Ray said. "Michael Park asked me about it after." He paused. "You told them you talked your way out of it." "I did." "Without mentioning?" "No." Ray was quiet for a moment. "Why not?" Chuck had been thinking about this since the 10 o'clock class. "Because the moment I mention the other option, the story becomes about the other option," he said. "It becomes a story about what I could have done instead of what I did. And what I did is the point." "The other option was also there," Ray said. "It wasn't theoretical." "Of course it was there," Chuck said. "It's always there. That's the whole problem with always being there. Because if it's always there, if the capability is always present, always available, always the largest and most visible option, then every interaction becomes potentially an occasion for it. Every threat, real or imagined, becomes an opportunity to demonstrate that the option exists." He paused. "That's not the practice I'm trying to teach, and it's not the practice I'm trying to live." Ray held the coffee cup. "You've thought about this a lot." "Since Korea," Chuck said. "Since the night Park Sung-jin came out of that doorway in Osanri and dealt with 3 men in 20 seconds and then walked me into a storeroom and handed me a cloth for my eye. He didn't say anything about what he'd done. He asked me what I was going to do with what I'd just seen. That was where the conversation started. And last night was the latest version of the conversation," Chuck said. "Every time something like that happens, I learn something about where I am in it." He paused. "Last night I learned that the presence is more reliable than I had previously known, not because I doubted it in theory, because now I know it in practice, in a situation where it wasn't theoretical." Ray looked at him for a moment. "And if they hadn't left, then I would have responded to what was actually happening," Chuck said, "with exactly the minimum required to stop it. No more." He paused. "But they did leave, because the thing that deters doesn't announce itself. It's just there." Uvinasorno Gasak, Part 6. The addition to the curriculum. He added something to the curriculum that month. Not a new technique. The curriculum was not deficient in techniques. Not a new form. The forms were adequate to what they were teaching. He added a conversation, which was a different kind of curriculum element than he had previously included. A structured discussion with students at the intermediate and advanced levels about the relationship between capability and its use. The discussion was not philosophical in an abstract sense. It was practical, what the training was for, in the specific and concrete terms of what it actually produced in the person who genuinely engaged with it. Not the physical capability, which was the most visible product and the one most discussed in the community. The other thing, the presence, the closure of the gap, the condition in which what you are and what you appear to be were the same thing, and the interaction this produced with the world around you. He told them about the parking lot. He told them about Park Sung-jin. He told them about the 15 years of understanding accumulated through the specific encounters that had produced it, what the practice was actually for. Some of the students heard it, some of them didn't. The ones who heard it were the ones who had already been developing, through the training, the internal experience he was describing, who recognized it as the name for something they had been building without a name for it. The ones who didn't hear it were the ones for whom the training was still primarily about the external capability, who had not yet arrived at the place where the external capability became transparent and what it was pointing to became visible. He had not expected all of them to hear it. He had not expected most of them to hear it. He had added the conversation to the curriculum because it was the honest account of what the practice was for, and his obligation to the students was to tell them what the practice was for, and the obligation to the obligation was to tell it even when most of them weren't yet at the place where they could fully receive it. Some of them would arrive at that place eventually, the ones who stayed in the practice long enough, the ones for whom the training became, as it had become for him, not a capability, but a condition, the permanent, ongoing quality of being what they were without the gap, without the management, without the performance. The night in the parking lot on Hawthorne Boulevard was not a story about a man who could have fought and chose to talk. It was a story about a man who had been building something for 15 years and who had just discovered that it was more completely built than he had known. One final no score buds theas Paul Spurts policy. Chuck Norris was, by 1974, the person the community described as a champion, undefeated, federally recognized, the subject of the martial arts press's most laudatory coverage. He was also in the streets around the dojo where he walked most evenings, simply a man walking. Nobody who encountered him in those walks knew what he was. The lack of announcement was not modesty, it was the condition he was describing in the curriculum edition. The gap was closed. What he was and what he appeared to be were the same thing. And that same thing, in the ordinary light of evening streets, was a man taking a walk. He had had 2 encounters over the years that followed a similar pattern to the parking lot. One in 1976, one in 1977, both resolved without physical contact, both involving the same mechanism, the quality of presence that the other party responded to before they fully understood why. He never wrote about them. He never described them in interviews. They were not the kind of story that fit the narrative the world had constructed around his name, and he had no particular interest in correcting that narrative. The narrative was the narrative. The reality was the reality. He walked home most evenings. He thought about whatever needed thinking. The streets of Torrance went about their ordinary business around him. Nothing happened. Most evenings, nothing happening was the whole point.